How's everybody doing today? Everybody excited for some command line? Yes. All right, yes, we love command line. My name is Peter Chittum. I've got a minute, so I guess I'll banter a little bit just so I don't really throw anyone off. Did you bring some for me? I'm a little hungry. Okay, I guess I'll get mine afterward. While we're getting going, so who here, raise your hand if you feel like you are super experienced with command lines. A few people, okay. Experienced? Comfortable? Yeah. Total newbie? Good, we have a few of you as well. I hopefully won't bore the super experienced people, because this is really meant to help sort of coax people who might be a little bit hesitant to adopt command lines, especially the Salesforce CLI, into doing so. So now I'll start. My name is Peter Chittum. I am a developer evangelist. I also lead the developer relations team in the EMEA region. I'm based in England, even though I don't sound like it. And this is my talk on the command line. This slide simply states, if I make any forward-looking statements, that you should not use any of those to make any purchasing decisions, and then we can move on. I also want to thank the Manchester Trailblazer Community Group and the Northern UK Trailblazer Community Developer Group. As a developer evangelist, sometimes my everyday problems don't completely overlap with the everyday problems of you who are out there using this in the field, in the trenches, on a day-to-day basis. And so I went and workshopped this idea with those community groups, and I got them to give me ideas so that I could bring you some of what I think are solutions to those problems. And for the total newbies, what is a command line? Just to level set here. CLI stands for Command Line Interface. It's just an app, and you type code or type instructions into it instead of clicking on buttons, right? Now, of course, Salesforce DX is the umbrella where the Salesforce CLI lives. This is, of course, our modern set of tools for developers in the Salesforce platform. And actually, before I go forward, I should mention that most people think of it as tools for the Lightning platform, but more and more teams in Salesforce are building plugins for the command line. For instance, Einstein Analytics is launching their command line plugin this release. So very soon you'll be able to do things like create Einstein Analytics apps through the command line as well. So don't just think of it as a Lightning tool, think of it as a general purpose Salesforce tool. It is the Salesforce CLI, not the Salesforce DX CLI. And of course, so this is kind of where this talk came from, is I would go and share with people and say, you should be using the Salesforce CLI. And they'd say, well, I'd use a Salesforce CLI, but I don't use Salesforce DX. Anyone ever think that? Yeah. Most people who think that, what they're thinking is, I don't use Scratch orgs, right? But the reality is, there is a whole lot of stuff that fits under the umbrella of Salesforce DX. If you are writing Apex, technically we think of that as Salesforce DX today. So anyone here writing Apex? Yes, you are all using Salesforce DX. So there we go. We've solved that problem. And of course, just because there are tons of tools in Salesforce DX around continuous integration and continuous delivery, doesn't mean you have to use them all. In fact, you can pick and choose and adopt the ones that you like. In fact, we are making this easier and easier to do today because in this release, in fact, in summer, we are releasing functionality GA so that you can deploy directly to sandboxes. We are releasing, I believe it is in pre-release right now, the ability to create sandboxes, to clone sandboxes from other sandboxes. So there are a bunch of features that we're adding to make it easier and easier to use the bits of Salesforce DX that make the most sense for you. So there you go. It's a buffet, not a fixed menu. And I like to think of the Salesforce command line as the best way to connect my laptop to my Salesforce environment, really. There are tons of APIs that you can access, and I'll try and get you to think about that a different way. Besides just the commands, some of the commands surface more features than you might expect. It works the same on Windows and on Mac, and part of the reason I decided to repeat this talk, because this is the same talk I gave at Dreamforce last year, is because when I gave it at Dreamforce last year, I gave it showing things on my Mac. I use my Mac on a daily basis. That's the environment I'm most comfortable with. How many here are everyday regular Mac users in your job? How many are everyday regular Windows users in your job? And there's more of you. So there you go. This is a little bit of a guilt talk, in other words. I feel like I should have been talking about Windows before. And so that's why I'm going to be doing my demos in Windows showing PowerShell. Now, as I say that, I just want to apologize because really I've only been using PowerShell for the last 2 weeks. But actually, I really like it, I have to say. It's a pretty powerful tool. And I'll probably just share my editorial thoughts as we go through as well, kind of the things I've found, how PowerShell works versus Bash, or I actually normally use Z Shell as my normal shell on Mac. Did I miss something on there? Oh, yeah. And of course, you can write custom plugins. I'm not going to cover custom plugins today. You can check that out. There's lots of other sessions that are talking about that. Anyone here kind of skeptical of using command lines? Any command line skeptics? Yeah, okay, that's fine. It's cool to be skeptic, you know. The reality is using a text-based user interface can actually increase productivity because once you get the command working, you can repeat that command over and over again. You can write it into a script. You can automate it very easily. I've just noticed my demo machine has been disconnected somehow. That's kind of, oh, it went black. Okay, there we go. Okay. Yes. Hello for Windows is amazing. Like the face recognition. All right. So, and the reality is, I love using a command line. I started using command lines when I first started using computers in the early 1990s with VAX VMS, and then I went away from them because there were lots of cool GUI interfaces and they were pretty. And then I've really come back to them in the last, I'd say, 6, 7, 8 years. And especially with Salesforce CLI, it's become a lot easier because mostly I do Salesforce development. And as the tools have gotten better for command line, that's what I've started to use. And of course, who here does not consider themselves to be a coder? Okay. So if you're in that crowd and you're thinking to yourself, I'm not a coder, why should I use a command line? Guess what? I gave a talk about that too. It's called, if you can write a Salesforce formula, you can use a command line. I would strongly recommend you check that out. The recording's on YouTube. I put the bit.ly link up there. And I put Melinda Smith's tweet about how cool she thought it was. I don't know if she's using the command line today, but at least on the day, I had her right in my hand. So let's see. So what are some of the things you can do with the command line? This is kind of a high-level list of things that are possible. And these are, think of these as kind of the broad topics that the command line addresses. So things like executing Apex, getting Apex logs, doing authorization for your Scratch org, for other orgs. I'll show you a cool trick with that. Data management, I think, is a really powerful one for managing development environments. The command line, I don't think, is the best tool for doing like mass movement of data from one org to another. It's not really intended for that. If you're going to do that, get a proper tool. But if you just need to get the right data into the right org, into the right environment, I think the command line's a great tool for that. Things you can do with Lightning, creating Visualforce pages, Apex classes, packaging, limits. So it's a big list of things that you have access to. And there we go. So how do these commands work is the next question. The first part of the command is SFDX. So this is the bit that you install on your computer. So whether that's Mac or Linux or Windows, there's an installer, and you get this executable. You then have the plugin that that's going to be run by SFDX. And so you can see this one is force data record get. Now, who here wants to take a stab on what this particular plugin does? Anyone? Shout it out. This is the audience participation portion of the talk. I'm going to get a record with that. So if I'm going to get a record, what are the things I need to tell the command line? What's the object type? Absolutely. What else? Yeah, which record or an ID possibly? Anything else? Yeah? What's that? Yeah. Your login? An alias or a login, yeah. So in other words, which user, which will also tell Salesforce which org, of course, right? So, and there you go. So those are the parameters. You actually knew the parameters as a group before I even showed them to you. So what I like to, in this example, and most of the command line examples are like this, they're very intuitive as far as how to use them. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that, I will say, but for the most part, if you're going to do common data operations, operations with users, assigning permission sets, the parameters that you need to know are very, very intuitive to use. All right. So there's a ton of things I could go over. When I gave this talk at Dreamforce, I had 40 minutes. Today I have 20 minutes, and my timer's off, so I'm not really sure how much time I have. How much time? I have 18 minutes left? I thought this was supposed to be a 20-minute talk. I got 30 minutes. There you go. All right. Well, if somebody starts like rushing the stage, I'll know that I've gone over my time. I'm just going to go through a few examples, and since I have more time than I expected, I might have some time for Q&A at the end, so we'll see how that goes. Every example I'm going to show you is in this GitHub repo, everyday-sfcli in my GitHub account. Feel free to go check that out. It's a combination now of some shell scripts that will run on Unix systems, and now I have some PowerShell scripts in there as well, organized by topic. So take a look at those. I'd love your feedback if you find them useful. The one thing I will say about PowerShell scripts, and if you are a PowerShell user, you will know this. If you are not, you will find this out. You need to sign PowerShell scripts to distribute them under a default PowerShell configuration. So I haven't done that. I'm thinking I probably won't, because I would rather you know what you are actually executing and actually open that and copy that to your own script than to actually do a self-signed script. I think that's probably just a little bit more secure. And yeah, so I'm probably not going to do signing of these, but do check them out and do give them a try. And with that, let's go to the demo. So there's this cool dual screen I've got today. How cool is that? I know, it's like magic. Technology is such an amazing thing, you know. The first thing I wanted to show was what do you have to do to set up your PowerShell environment. And there is, of course, an analogous part to this if you're running, if you're using Bash or Z Shell. There are going to be certain environment variables that you want to set up. There are going to be certain shortcuts that you might want to set up for yourself. And in PowerShell, what's nice is there's actually just a system variable for this. So I've set these up under current user all hosts. So what that means is that as long as I'm executing PowerShell as me, and that doesn't mean administrator. These actually won't work for the administrator. They'll just work for me. Then I will get some cool things. So I've done something like, so I do have a, so I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. There we go. Yeah, better in the back? Good? Okay. On the first line, you can see I've just set up a path to where I'm going to stick my own personal scripts. And then I'm going to go to my home directory. And then after that, I have a bunch of functions. Now, all of these functions are just little shortcuts that for really common, repetitive things that I do with the Salesforce CLI. Things like opening my default org or opening a specific named org, pushing to my default org, pulling from my default org. These are all things that are really, really common. So in what I found is in PowerShell, it was much easier to do this as functions. And you can see why. So for instance, on that first one on line 5, DX open is my little shortcut. In PowerShell, I wanted to either do the default user or a named alias or user. And so I was able to sort of mock the -u parameter that Salesforce DX expects for that user name or alias. The rest of them I just have as regular functions. You can see a couple of other ones. So switching back and forth between the pre-release plugin and the GA plugin, I find annoying to have to know all of those. Like just to know SFDX plugins install at Salesforce, I don't want to have to remember that. So I just have my little shortcut. What I'll say is that for my Mac, I just have these set up as aliases. And I actually like the aliases a little bit better because they just expand the command, run it, and then I can still use the Salesforce DX parameters after that. You can see with the PowerShell functions, it's a little bit more clunky to get it going, but actually I still like the functions pretty well. And then I just have a couple of helper functions that I've added. One is that every time I run a script that is going to execute Salesforce DX, I want to make sure Salesforce DX is installed. Now, initially, I just had a little block of code. I was copying and pasting that into several scripts, and I said, that's no fun. You know, the whole dry principle thing. And so I thought, well, I'll just stick this as a function in my profile, and now there we go. So it just attempts to find the SFDX command, and if it doesn't, I'm just throwing an error, and then I can exit gracefully out of my script. The last one is one that I'll use in several scripts, which is I want to provide parameters in these scripts that I will pass through to Salesforce DX. And I just wanted to be able to, if I have the parameter in PowerShell in my script, I wanted to be able to format that with the correct parameter in Salesforce DX. So it's just a little mapping function that takes the parameter and the name, the parameter name in Salesforce DX, the parameter value that I want, and then it just passes that back out so that I can format my actual command in my scripts. So it's just a little bit of setup that I did to get that going. All right, so there we go. So profile. If you're using Bash, you probably already know that that's going to be your Bash RC file or Bash profile. And here's how we do it in PowerShell. Now, the next thing I wanted to share is auth URL. So auth URL is super powerful. When I go and authorize Salesforce command line to an org, so whether that is creating a new Scratch org or going through web auth and authorizing an existing org like a Sandbox or a Developer Edition or production even, or if I'm doing it with a JWT token, any of those things, what's going to happen is Salesforce DX is going to store an authorization URL encrypted on my local file system. And the cool thing is I can get to that, and I can pass it to either myself so that I can authorize that same user on a different environment, or I can pass it maybe to a colleague, same thing, that maybe they want to log into a Scratch org. You know, maybe I'm sitting in England where I live, and I'm talking to my colleague Renee, who's in Germany. I want to show him something that's going on. I don't want to bother creating a user record, so I just pass this in a file, and then he can go in and execute a command locally in his Salesforce DX, and he'll be able to access the same org with the same authorization token. And the only thing is that getting to that, so yes, SFDX, force, org. There we go. So force org display is how we find out about the authorization of a given user, actually. So it's a little bit misleading. It says org display. It's actually really reflecting information about a specific user's authorization onto an org. And you can see there's actually an access token up there. If you know how to construct the SFDX URL, you can derive it. Or if you're lazy, you just do verbose, and you will actually get the URL directly there. Now, this is being recorded. The nice thing, this is a scratch org, so I'm going to delete this after this talk, just so nobody can punk me on my scratch org. But there it is. So SFDX auth URL toward the bottom. It's the long one around down the bottom. That is actually a token that I can pass into another environment. So what I did, I'm actually going to switch out here. And that'll take a moment. All right. So I'm now in another laptop. This one's my Mac. And I need to get access, because I'm using both machines maybe for development, or maybe, again, I'm getting a colleague to have access to it. So I believe, where did I put this? There we go. So I'm going to do SFDX force auth. And this one is SFDX URL store. And I'll just do -h, because this is not one I use very often, so I just want to remind myself. There we go. So we'll do -f, temp, and then there's the actual. So I would have exported this to a file, passed it to myself, and then I can do -a, temp, scratch org. And if I could even make this my default org in this environment if I want to with -s. And this should just take a moment, and then I can do DX open. That's my little alias that I use to not have to type out SFDX force org open every time. And now I've accessed the same org. Oops, hello. Let's see. Yeah, we're going to hear from my brother. I don't know. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so what just happened there? There it is. Well, that was very interesting, but I am in that org, finally. And so, I thought this is actually a really handy thing. So what I decided to do was actually one shell script, or one PowerShell script I thought would be really useful, is to just run a script that will export that token to a file so that I don't have to copy and paste it. Because right now, there is no export to file option with that. So that's what I did. And that's this first script that I'll show here. I call it get_org_key_file. And I tried to follow the standard naming convention for PowerShell, which is verb and then action. No, verb and, I guess, noun. Yeah. So here I have a required parameter org user or alias. And then I'm just executing force org display. I have the verbose in there, and then I'm using the JSON because actually I really like how the PowerShell tools for manipulating JSON I think are pretty powerful. I like them. So I was using that. I do a convert from JSON after I invoke my command. So there's SFDX is the SFDX command. DX command is force org display. And then params is just how I've formatted the params right there. And I actually have a template script in my directory and I just kind of follow the same pattern all along. And obviously SFDX never changes, but I thought I would just separate that into its own command just for ease, and to have it separate from the actual plugin that I'm executing. And then I simply convert from JSON. I can specify an actual output file name, and then it's going to say I successfully did this. So if I go back and run this, so I can do get org key file. Oop. I went and cleared that, didn't I? Let's do this one more time. SFDX force org display. There we go. I'll then grab that. Oop. There we go. Now let's try that. Get org. There we go. And then, again, one of the things I really like about PowerShell is when you declare parameters, it's just automatically part of the variable expansion, so that's cool. So org user or alias, that's going to be the local one, so I don't need that. What do I need? I need... Ew. Oh, I guess that is it. Okay. All right. Let me just take another look here. Yes, okay. Oh, actually, that's another thing I can just show. Also, because I made it required, it'll prompt me as well. So there we go. So that's going to go, it'll run the same command that I did, and then dir, I can see there's my actual text file that it exported right there. So again, I mean, this is kind of the power of command line. You know, the command line itself, I think, is really powerful. But obviously, wrapping this into a script makes it something that you can do more repetitively. Or if you are working with somebody who isn't so comfortable or familiar with command line, you can always give them a script to run, and that's going to be a lot easier for them to do these repetitive commands as well. And you'll also be sort of helping somebody, you know, open up their mind to what you can do with the command line, if you think about it that way. All right. Let's go back to the slides here. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is limits. I think limits is really a pretty cool, powerful thing, because you can literally just go in here and with one command, find out what are your current org limits. And I think this is one of those things that I'm constantly hunting around in setup to try and like, okay, so what is my current report run limit right now, right? So again, I thought, well, this would be a really handy one to do. So I've get limit, what did I call this one? There we go. There we go. So get org limits. I won't go through all the details of this, but I can simply do that. So get org limits. There we go. And then I can actually specify org user or alias, and we'll do a different org this time. And there we go. So what's my current limit for that particular org? Now, one of the things I did in my bash scripts that I didn't have time to do here is actually do some parsing of this. So I could do what are all the daily limits I should be tracking, and where are they today? What are the hourly ones? You know, and that way I don't have to dig through all of these. I can just look at the ones I'm most concerned with right then and there. So again, I have those in bash, but I didn't re-implement them in PowerShell yet. The last thing I want to talk about is data management. And data management could be your data, like your actual business data. But I want everyone here to take a moment and think about your org, that it's not an environment. It's actually a big chunk of lots of different kinds of data. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, certainly, like I said, you know, the data that you're using, that your users access, that's data. But have you ever thought of your sandbox as data? Because it is. It's called Sandbox Info. And you can actually look at the status of your sandboxes through there. This was actually, I thought this was a really fun demo to do, but now we actually have the command to directly do this through the command line. But the one thing I don't think we've implemented is Sandbox Process will show you the current refresh status. So if you go and query Sandbox Process with a particular Sandbox ID, you can then go and find out, okay, what is my current status for that? And then I think user management is actually really handy as well. If I needed to deactivate a user, for instance, that would be actually a really handy thing to do sometimes, and I don't want to have to maybe log into the org. So that is what I did with this last script that I'll show. Okay, so this should be set user inactive. And the user to deactivate is going to be john@lab.practice. And I must have another parameter in there. Yes, and we're going to do that in this org here. And I should actually be logged into this org. So yes, that's the one right there. Just refresh it, make sure I'm actually still logged in. Yes, I am. That's good. So that's this user right here, John Ross. I've decided we need to deactivate this user for whatever reason. Maybe they've left the company. Maybe we're concerned there's a security problem, whatever. I can simply go in and run the script. And all that this is doing is wrapping the command, which is force record update. I set the isActive flag to false. And just like that, my user is deactivated. There we go. And so I can go back in here, and I should be able to refresh. And there we go. So there's John Ross deactivated from the command line in one very short command, and pretty intuitive one at that. So with that, let's wrap up. There is a ton of things that you can do with your org using the command line. Hopefully you got an idea today of just a taste of a few of these things. If you want to see the longer edition of this, that's all Bash-based, you can go and watch my presentation from Dreamforce last year. And certainly I'm happy to take questions after this on the side. There's a couple of things that came out of those focus groups that I ran that I never got to go and play around with. One is to mass delete reports. This was an admin request that they thought this would be really handy. I never got around to it. I don't think it would be too hard to do, to be honest. And the other one is mass change emails for Sandbox users. So we all know that when you generate a new Sandbox, the user emails are sort of a pre-formatted. And if you have specific email addresses that you need to test against, setting those in the command line would be really easy because, again, this is just force record update. So there we go. I don't really have time for questions. However, I will share a few suggestions for where you can go next. Of course, Trailhead has a number of modules that you can check out related to all of the Salesforce DX functionality, so do check those out. And with that, I would like to say thank you.